Ronaldo, are you ready to continue?
Yes.
You can start, please.
Okay. So, I was discussing wall effects. Now, we can discuss another point that is also interesting in the context of these avalanches that is used in systems in statistical mechanics, but what is not advancing now, which is the issue of aberrant correlation. So there are in many cases when you see avalanches, and the terminology is borrowed from seismology and earthquakes. What you have is that one main shock, like it's like a very large avalanche, and induced by this very large main avalanche, you can have other smaller avalanches that come afterwards, close in space and time, that are called aftershocks. So in the case of earthquakes, these aftershocks, this correlation between the time of the main shock and the time of the aftershocks is called the Omori law, that states that the rate of aftershocks after a main event decreases as a power law with some exponent that in the case of earthquakes is close to 1. The point is, when we look at the statistics, for example, of earthquakes, what we know is the time in which some earthquake of some magnitude took place. But we don't have a label if this is an earthquake or a main shock or an aftershock. So what it's done in seismology, and also it has also been applied in other cases of avalanche behavior in physics, is a method called the nearest neighbor proximity. And the idea is that if I have, let's say, a series of earthquakes taking place, or events taking place at some times and some positions, and characterized by some magnitude that essentially is related to the energy released. In earthquakes, the magnitude is simply defined by the logarithm of energy, and then it follows, instead of a power law, an exponential distribution. So if we order these events in time, we find enough proximity that is proportional to the difference between these two events in time, the difference in space to the power d, which is the fractal dimension of the sets of events, times this probability of observing an event of magnitude I. And essentially, this proximity gives for some event j, what is the expected number of events of a given magnitude mi that are observed in a given interval in time and a given distance if the events take place at random, if they are a Poisson process. So the idea is that if this distance is very small, this is something that is very unlikely to be produced by random, because the events take place as a Poisson process. So if we consider for events j the smallest event I, the event I that provides at the smallest distance, we can associate these two events as being strongly correlated. And then for each event j, defines a predecessor, which is the one that minimizes this proximity. So the idea, when I have a set of, let's say, events, if I have one event that it does not have any predecessor, I can say that this is an aftershock, this is a main event, and then if this has associated this predecessor, I can say that this one is an aftershock of this main one. If this is also associated as the one a predecessor, this is a second aftershock, and this is a third aftershock. In this way, we can classify our events as main events and aftershocks. If we do this in earthquakes, there is the problem that there are also random things, so there is what is called some background activity. So a method to just discern this background random activity is make a rescaling in time, defining an effective time and an effective distance that depends on the magnitude, and make this plot, and then we can observe that there is some piece of the events, some set of events in this phase space that can be associated to random processes. Because essentially, we completely randomize the data, this randomized data just collapses with this distribution. Instead, there is other part of nodes that are outside this, let's say, Poisson cloud of events. And these are, let's say, the modes or the points that have to be considered as real correlated events, and that can be associated to aftershocks of some given main shock. If we do these statistics, this classification in real aftershocks, okay, we get this distribution of inter-event times between aftershocks and main shocks, and we get power law distribution with the slope that is close to 1. We can do this same thing in our fish, yes, but taking into account 2 things. First, in earthquakes, the duration of an earthquake is essentially considered as 0, so they're just point processes. Instead, our avalanches have some finite duration. So if I have 2 avalanches, I and j, I define the time between these 2 avalanches as the time between the end of the first avalanche and the start of the second avalanche. Okay. Also, the avalanche move in space. So if there is an avalanche that starts at some time, the school will move along their trajectory during the duration of this avalanche. So we consider the distance between 2 avalanches as the distance between the center of the mass of an avalanche I at its end and the center of mass of the following avalanche. And we consider in this case a fractal dimension equal to. If we do this thing and we make this plot, we can see that there is again a region of, let's say, uncorrelated random effects. And here there is another cloud of points that lie outside this, let's say, uncorrelated part. Why do we have this Poisson cloud of uncorrelated events? Because if we think in the evolution of our fish, what we can have is that there is some avalanche that takes place here, then the school moves, and after a very long time, there is another avalanche in a place that is very close to this one in particular. So since our proximity takes into account differences in time and differences in space, I can have like fake correlations that are given by 2 avalanches separated by a very long time, but just by chance took place very close in space. And this is the origin of this, let's say, cloud of uncorrelated events. Oh, if we do this thing, when we can compute our Omori law, taking this form, which is called the Omori-Utsu law, which is like some corrections of the simple Omori law, taking into account that we can have some constant term here in the in this inter-event time distribution of aftershocks, and we recover again, like in the case of earthquakes, some power law distribution, but now with an exponent that is larger than the one that we observe in real earthquakes. This is an exponent that is close to 2 instead of the exponent close to 1 that you observe in earthquakes. Okay, so far so good. This should be the end of my first lecture, which, as I anticipated, has taken longer. So let me go for the second part. Share this one. Okay. So finishing this part, let's go to explain a little bit how can we model the movement of schooling fish using a stochastic approach. Here in the first part, I was just making this, discussing this model of fish movement. This is like a very, very physical model. So we have like things, they just move, they just orient to nearest neighbors. There is some source of nose, very generic. Let's try to do this thing a little bit better and especially a little bit more data-driven. So formalism to represent the movement of fish that has been used in many different contexts by many different authors is in the context of stochastic or Langevin equations, which is something that was also discussed by Erwin in his lecture. The idea is that I describe the properties of some quantity in terms of a stochastic of Langevin equation, in which what I have is that the derivative of this quantity has some deterministic term that is called drift that can account, for example, for Newton's law or friction of interactions with individuals. And there is another term that comes multiplied by a noise term. And this noise term corresponds to some uncorrelated white noise with essentially zero correlations. And this function here, it represents the diffusion of my system in terms of this stochastic of Langevin equation. So to make things a little bit more, let's say, practical, so we can consider, for example, Brownian motion. We have a single particle that is subject to some potential. It has some constant friction that just makes that velocity cannot become very large. I have some correlated noise that in the case of a Brownian particle, this accounts for example, just being heated by particles in a fluid in which this Brownian particle is moving. And then I have my standard law of inertia, the derivative of space is equal to velocity. Derivative of velocity has this form. This is a very simple example. It can be solved analytically. And essentially, what you obtain is a Maxwell distribution for both the position and velocity. And the thing is that if you look at the profile of velocity, for example, this is the profile of the velocity along the x direction, you see that it's a perfect Gaussian, as you expect from this theoretical result, this exact result. But this is a Brownian particle. This is an inert particle. So it just moves because it's being heated by the particles in the fluid substrate, and it is like, let's say, contained by some potential, but this is not exactly the case of our fish. Our fish have some self-propulsion, so they just move because they inject energy into the system. So this can be represented in terms of what is called the active Brownian particle model, in which we have the same equation as before, but now this, let's say, this dissipative force can depend on position and velocity, can have a sign that is positive or negative, so it can have the effect of injecting energy into the particle. So if you choose this quantity, this dissipative force appropriately, you can have self-propulsed particles. A typical form of self-propulsion in biology is this one. And then you can make simulations of this model with any potential, like this one. This is simulations for, let's say, a simple square potential, like a spring potential. And what you get is like this sort of donut movement of the particles. And the profile of the velocity takes this particular form. This is called a hat distribution. So you have a low probability for small velocities and high probability for velocities close to this v sub 0. And then this thing decays. If you look at the profile of velocity, it has this sort of a Gaussian mixture. It's like the sum of two Gaussians centered in minus v0 and plus v0. Okay. Okay, if we want to simulate, let's say, many interacting particles, the thing becomes more complicated because we have to just, let's say, define what are the interparticle interactions, the forces that one particle, one fish exerts onto another. If we have experimental animals that they are moving in a tank, we must include boundary conditions. And this is, let's say, quite more complex than these simple equations that I have shown you before. So here what we do is a simplified approach. It's like take the trajectory of each fish in the lab, so the trajectories that we record, and just decompose it into contributions. One is the center of mass position, and then the relative position of each fish in the frame of reference given by the center of mass. And then we can write position in the lab is, that depends, it's different for each fish, is the position of the center of the mass, which is the same for all fish, plus this relative position, which is defined for each fish. Okay. So the idea is to decompose my set of moving fish into the moving of this, let's say, this effective fish, which is the center of mass, and the relative motion of the fishes in the center of mass reference frame. Okay? Now, if we look only at the center of mass position, so this is the, let's say, the profile of the movement in the space. So that you see, they have this tendency like just to make these turns. So they sort of make this donut distribution in a space, turning around along the walls of the tank. And if you look at the profile of the velocity, you see this sort of star-shaped thing or diamond shape that essentially accounts this, let's say, these high probabilities for this value essentially accounts that when you reach this wall, you have a strong tendency to go in this direction. When you reach this wall, you have a strong tendency to go in this direction, and this explains the asymmetry. So these asymmetry things are essentially due to the boundary effects of my square tank. If you make simulations, you make experiments in a circular tank, this thing does not show this sort of asymmetry. Okay. Now, if we look at the movement of the center of mass, we see that it performs like smooth trajectories. But if you realize this particle, the center of mass particle, has this tendency to just somehow slide along the walls. So the movement when they reach a wall is many times like sort of sliding instead of bounding or bounding like this. There's sort of tendency to just modify the movement to slide along the wall. Okay, we can just look also at the velocity, and if we make these profiles of velocity for coordinate x or coordinate y, you see that this can also be fitted to a Gaussian mixture. Also, due to the experimental considerations, this is just finite simulation. There are not infinite many frames here. They are not like exactly symmetrical, but they have this tendency to behave like a Gaussian mixture, the velocities. So the idea is, okay, let's try to implement these observations into simple stochastic equation for the movement of the center of the mass. So the idea is, I will use like a pseudo particle that is not small, but it's a particle that has some radius. And this radius is the radius of gyration, because obviously the center of mass cannot go close to the wall at distance much smaller than the center of mass, just by the definition of the center of mass. Okay. So for this pseudo particle, we will consider a term of friction that injects energy, because this is given the shape of this distribution, let's say a Gaussian mixture, this is what we expect in this sort of model in which we have injection of energy. So we will use this dissipation term. And then we will also consider a potential or a force, essentially a non-potential form and a potential force that gives me this idea that I am in a tank with hardcore walls. I cannot cross the wall, but I also have this tendency to just slide along. And this we can reproduce using this part here that gives the idea of the hard wall, and this term here that depends on the angle between the velocity and the normal direction of the walls, that makes that this force is stronger when you go against the wall or you go away from the wall than if you go along the wall. So the idea with this term here is that you go along, your repulsion is smaller than if you go in the direction of the wall. Okay, you can make simulations of these complicated stochastic differential equations, and what you observe is this comparison between the model and the experiments, and you see, okay, I can, not exactly, but I can reproduce quite nicely this donut shape of trajectories and this star shape of velocities. But not only that, I can also reproduce other aspects of the dynamics of the model. For example, if I look at the root mean, at the mean square displacement of the center of the mass, is the line in green for different experiments, you see that it grows ballistically and then saturates and has these sort of oscillations with some period that are, these oscillations are due to the effects of the tanks of the wall. In the model, you can reproduce very nicely this behavior with also oscillations that have more or less the same period as the experimental results. Okay, So that was the easy part, just modeling the center of mass. And now let's try to model the dynamics in the center of mass reference frame. Okay, now you have a distribution of positions that has some, let's say, polar symmetry. Okay, has this symmetry in polar coordinates. This is essentially a distribution of particles is homogeneous within a distance which is proportional to the radius of duration and indicates exponentially away from this distance, for distances larger of the radius of duration. So if we plot the radial density profile, we get this more or less flat zone. Distance is smaller than the radius of duration and this exponential decay. And you get the same sort of behavior for experiments performed with different number of fish. If you look at the velocity, again, you have like this circular symmetric profile. But if you look at the profiles of velocities in the different components, you see that these are different from Gaussian. So they have exponential tails, not Gaussian tails. And this is a hint that in the equation that I will use, this term here, this diffusion, cannot be constant. If diffusion is constant, you essentially what you have is profiles of velocity that have a Gaussian form. Here, since I don't want to see profiles with a Gaussian velocity because they are not seen experimentally. This is an indication that this term here in my stochastic equation cannot be constant. Must be some function of velocity or distance. So this we are in the case now what we want to impose in our system what is called a multiplicative noise. Okay, also if we look at the dynamics of the turning rate, we see also that this is not a Gaussian. This is something more related with a power law with some constant stuff here. Another thing that we can do is look at the correlations between velocity and the turning rate, and we can see that turning rate between different fishes almost no correlations. Velocity between pair of fishes is something that is mildly correlated, and these correlations decay quite quickly. Around 1 second, the movement of fish are completely uncorrelated. So, with these ingredients, essentially what we are going to propose to model this behavior in the center of mass reference frame is that we are going to look for equations that involve the turning rate and the velocity of the fish, which is something that is also commonly done when studying or when proposing stochastic equations for fish movement. But we will make, let's say, an even more let's say, strong simplification is that since the movement of individual fish are quite uncorrelated from each other, what we will posit is an equation for a single effective fish that moves in an effective potential that represents the interactions with the rest of the fish. So we'll just model one single fish and assume that the rest of the fish is some sort of effective mean field potential. Okay. Another key point is that the center of mass reference, it can be an accelerated system of reference, or it can be non-Galilean. So we might have some special forces that arise just because my system is being accelerated. So I must be careful because apart from, let's say, forces that can arise from, let's say, this effective potential, this effective containing potential, I might have some other forces that appear. And that in principle, I cannot say how these forces are going to be, but I will show you that there is some, let's say, mechanical, mathematical way in which we can induce the shape of this special force that appear in my stochastic equations. Okay. So what will be this effective potential? You have seen that this profile takes this form. Okay, this is the density, the occupation density in the reference, in the center of mass reference frame is something essentially constant and then decreases exponentially. If we look at the results I mentioned for the Brownian particle, what we propose is an effective potential that takes this form, the exponential of the effective potential is proportional to this density, and this effective potential is what keeps my effective fish trapped inside the center of mass reference frame. So the idea is that with effective potential, my fish will not wander away from the vicinity of the center of mass. So this shape here can be fitted to this form numerically, and then the idea is that the force is given by the derivative of the gradient of the potential. My effective force takes this shape, so an effective force that points along the vector, unitary vector of r, of the radius. Now, if I write my set of equations in polar coordinates, I have typical ones for position. For velocity, since I have this potential that is keeping my particles, let's say, contained in the vicinity of center of force, this potential in polar coordinates translates in an effective force for the modulus of the velocity and an effective force for the angle formed by the velocity. That this can be written down in these simple analytical forms. So these will be forces arising from the effective potential, but I was mentioning, could have other forces. These other forces, I don't know what they are, right? Okay. So I represent them from some function, for V, some function for the turning rate, and then I have these, let's say, diffusion terms that in principle I also don't know. So how can I get an idea of this, the form of these functions? So if we consider this system of equations, this term, given this form here, this potential, this shape, only has an effect when I am away from the critical point. So this density is essentially flat. So the force that this potential exerts on the particles, it's felt only when I'm far away from the radius of gyration. And when I close to the radius of gyration, essentially this effective force does not exist. Takes a value of 0. So what I can do is just analyze the movement of my particles inside the radius of gyration, and in this approximation, I just can disregard these trapping forces due to my effective potential. And I will only have this part here and this part here. Okay. So using a technique that is called the kernel-based regression method for the Kramers-Moyal expansion of the Fokker-Planck equation corresponding to my Langevin equation. So I have this Langevin equation. This is the Fokker-Planck equation. So now I can compute these terms, drift and diffusion, in this way, and I can estimate from numerical data these quantities using a kernel-based regression method. And I will do these averages only in the sections that are not affected by the potential. That is, where within trajectories, sections of the trajectories of the fish within the radius of gyration. And I can do this, and that's what I get is some estimates of my functions that take this form. Here we have some funny term 1 over b. This is linear. This is linear. This has, for the turning rate, has this particular form depending on the modulus, etc. Okay, this is the data that we obtain from the kernel regression method, and these are just estimates close to the small values of the velocity or omega, where the statistics is larger. So here are the horrendous final stochastic equation that I have to solve. These are all the terms I have computed. These are Gaussian white noises. Point here is that all the parameters, except this parameter here, and this same parameter here, they come from experimental data. They have been estimated analyzing the trajectories of fish. So the only free parameter in the model is this quantity A. So we have to fit it. The way to fit it is just performing simulations, computing several distributions, comparing these distributions with empirical data, and just fitting A by minimizing the Kullback-Leibler divergence from between the numerical distribution and the empirical one. Okay, and this is something that can be done considering different distributions, performing some steepest descent machine learning like algorithm. And from here we get an estimate of the best parameter A in my model. By the way, I forgot to mention that here in the case of the center of mass, I have also some parameters. This essentially this parameter A and this parameter U sub 0. These parameters are also fitted, this minimizing the Kullback-Leibler divergence with respect to numerical to empirical distributions. Okay, when we perform our simulations, we can see that we can get, for the fitted parameters, we get a very good estimate of the velocity modulus of the distribution of the modulus of velocity, a very good estimate of the distribution of the turning rate. Also, very good approximations to the empirical density profiles. Very good approximations to the mean square displacements. This is for experiments with, I forgot to add it, with different number of fish. I think this is 40, 50, and 60. So we can reproduce quite nicely the behavior of both the movement of the center of mass of our flock and the movement of this effective fish inside the center of mass of our system. So the idea is that, okay, like this. What we can do is simulate a synthetic school. Once I have these two ingredients, how can I do that? For example, what I can do is to simulate n fish in the laboratory, I make one simulation for the center of mass of the n fish, and then I make n simulations for n independent effective fish moving in the effective potential generated by my model. And in this way, I can get n trajectories of fish in a synthetic school. So you can compare the synthetic fish in a tank with a real fish, and I leave as an exercise to the reader to tell me which one is the real fish, which one is the synthetic one. So the patterns are quite nice. Another thing that we can do is, simulate an infinite school. How can we simulate an infinite school in this case? We can simulate an infinite school assuming that it has an infinite radius of duration. Okay. If we do an infinite school with an infinite radius of duration, this effectively is simulating my how to say, my synthetic fish, but with no trapping effective potential. If the radius of duration is infinite, then you never see the attraction, so you can go and expand however you want. And then you can make your simulations and observe that, okay, this is wrong, this is not 60, 50, 40, because it is an infinite school. What you can see with different simulations is that you start with a super diffusive ballistic regime in the mean square displacement, but despite all the complicated things that I have added, all these terms, all these things, or these multiplicative noises, at the end, for long times, an infinite school will go to a regime that is diffusive. Okay. So this is again some empirical evidence that has been published some time ago, just telling that this schooling fish has some super diffusive behavior, not ballistic, but super diffusive with an exponent between 1 and 2 in the mean square displacement. Here it's clear that at least with our model, you have a ballistic regime and then a diffusive regime, like if it was a normal or Ornstein-Uhlenbeck particle active Brownian motion. Another thing that you can do with your synthetic schools is just measure things, or check things that you can measure in real schools. For example, in real schools, I can have avalanches, turning avalanches. Okay, I can take my synthetic schools and just make the same sort of analysis and just observe that my synthetic school can reproduce avalanches that have an scale-free form, similar to the one that you observe in the real fish. They are not exactly equal, but they have these scale-free forms with exponents that are reasonably similar to the ones that you observe in real schools. So the idea is that is using this trick of decomposing movement of my school into movement of the center of mass plus the movement of independent effective fishes, a set of n independent fishes moving in some effective potential, we can reproduce many of the features that we observe in the dynamics of real schools of fish. How much I have is like 10 minutes. No? Sorry, Mr. Chairman?
13 minutes.
15 minutes. Okay, I'll
13.
try 15. Okay, I'll probably go with less. Just to finish, I'd like to also explain, let's say, a different, it's similar model. The previous one was a stochastic model, but was, let's say, physically inspired. It was data-driven, but it was physically inspired. Now let's go to another one that is more biologically inspired, looking at how fish should behave, and just trying to, with this observation of how fish should behave, trying to add, let's say, physical terms in the description that can fit our observations or our expectations of how fish move. So there's traditional biological inspired models of fish are called zonal models, and the idea is that fish experiment different sort of interactions that can take place at different zones. For example, there are some individual forces, which is self-propulsion and noise, that these are experienced at any distance, and are individual forces that are experienced by the fish himself or itself independently of the neighbors, and some other social forces that are due to the interactions with neighbors that can be experienced in different zones, in which we have, for example, some repulsion zone that is a repulsion to avoid collisions. There is an attraction zone that the idea is that fish are social and they want to keep the school compact. But there is also some alignment interaction that essentially means that if I see neighbors traveling in some direction, I want to go in that same direction. So these zonal modes, which were initially proposed by Ian Cousin in 2003, thus we can reproduce physical observations of real fish, like flocking, milling, this like of toroidal form of movement, swarming, which is like disorder, depending on the parameters of the model. So in this spirit of a zonal model, let's consider a standard model for schooling, in which we have Newton's law, and I have force equal to acceleration. I consider mass equal to 1. And I have social forces, which are attraction, repulsion, and alignment, and these individual forces, which is friction, propulsion, and noise. And then for friction and propulsion, I use this, this form, which is typical also in the description of fish. Noise, just following tradition in some models, we have a component of noise in the velocity along the direction of the velocity and another component perpendicular to the direction of the velocity. And then we have attraction repulsion that is simulated in terms of some spring interactions that the sign changes according to some distance that separates the region of attraction and the region from repulsion. And then alignment is studied using this simple form, just some force that tends to make velocities similar. Okay, social force is the sum of these forces, and then we average overall neighbors, just to give some idea that faraway neighbors might be, let's say, less influential than close neighbors. We just normalize individual social forces by the distance. Then the idea is, okay, these forces, they are very nice. Oops. But maybe we would like, apart from proposing them, to measure them experimentally. So this is a problem that can be tackled using the technique of the force maps. The idea is, assume Newton's law. I cannot measure forces, but I can measure accelerations. Okay, assume I have accelerations that depend on some relevant variables. Then I measure empirically the accelerations. And then let's focus on some particular variables, velocity, position, etc. What I can do is consider my velocity, and keeping fixed this quantity, this variable that I'm interested in, I average over all the rest of variables. If there are sufficient symmetries, this average will cancel the effects of the other variables, and what I will see here is the dependence of the acceleration, or, according to my assumption, the dependence of the force on this particularly chosen variable. Okay? So I can do this applied to the standard model. So in the case of the standard model, this is the attraction repulsion that I am imposing. So I expect attraction at short distances, repulsion at large distances. So this is the force map, the acceleration computed. This is the plot of this force that you should expect from this equation. When you consider this force map centered in the nearest neighbors, in the nearest neighbor, in such a way that this is essentially like a force field. So here is the neighbor. In my focal particle is located here, it will experience this force, which is repulsion. If it is located here, it will experience this force pointing inwards, which is an attraction. Okay, this is what I expect. If I simulate my model, I compute a force map from experimental data, I get exactly the same thing. Okay, so repulsion at short distances, attraction at large distances. For the alignment force has this tendency, so I expect velocities to become close to each other. If I make this plot as a function of the difference between the velocity of the focal point and the velocity of the nearest neighbor, what I have is all these forces, by this equation, point inwards, that they tend to make this difference of velocity zero, that I try to make the velocities equal. And if I make simulations, essentially I get the same result, all arrows pointing inwards. Okay, let's do this thing with real fish. So let's focus in the acceleration as a function of position, averaging over all the rest of variables. According to my standard model, I expect some attraction at short distances, which is, repulsion at short distances, which is what I see, and attraction at large distances, which is what I see. So experimental fish behave in a way that is compatible, with this standard model. What happens with the alignment? So I was proposing this alignment. Whatever are the velocities, velocity of one fish tends to become the velocity of the other fish. Now what I see in experimental fish is that the arrows in this force map, they point inwards in this part of the force map, but in the lower part of the force map, but in the upper part, they point outwards. So what does this thing mean? In this lower part here, this is the relative difference. So this means that this focal fish is moving slower than the neighbor, which is in the center. And then what I have is velocities, these arrows pointing inwards. So these arrows make the velocities become closer. So with respect to neighbors that are moving slower than the focal fish, we have alignment. Velocities tend to become similar. But in this part of the diagram, this is positive differences. So this means that the focal individual moves faster than the nearest neighbor. And in this case, what we observe are arrows that point outwards. And this means that the velocities the difference in the velocities tends to become larger. And this is interpreted as some sort of anti-alignment. So in this region, when my neighbors are faster than me, I tend to align my velocity with my neighbors. In this region, when my neighbors move slower than me, I do not tend to align my velocity with them. So the idea is this can be interpreted as some sort of, let's say, let's say, what was the word? Selective, sorry, interactions. When I see a neighbor that is going faster than me, I tend to align my velocity with this neighbor. When I see a neighbor that is going faster than me, I just don't try to follow him. I don't copy its direction. So how can we just try to represent these things? So for example, one could do like a brute force approach is that, okay, let's consider an interaction rule and alignment forces that are just given by the experimental data. I get this experimental data and just, let's say, interpolate points and just use that in the model. Well, doesn't work very well because you get fish that move in a natural way. So there are some fish that just become in the anti-alignment zone, and then what they do is just they speed up and they can just fly very far away from the school. So this is not a very physical representation of my school. What we found is that what it's the better way just to reproduce what we observe in these interaction maps is just to assume that these interaction forces of alignment have a selective nature. This was I was telling you. Individuals that see a neighbor that is going faster than the individual, they tend to align with his velocity. And when they see somebody that is traveling at a smaller velocity, they just disregard this neighbor. So the idea is that we have forces, social forces, that are interpreted in a selective way according to the relative velocity of the focal fish and the neighbor. And in this way, we can get just fish that move in a very natural way. And with this model, we can reproduce many of the properties that are empirically observed and in real school fish. Okay, I think that it's time to finish. So the conclusions is that the movement of animals, nature, biology are complex systems, and they are very complex system. But the tools of statistical physics and complex system science can lend a hand just to try to better understand the properties and the behavior of these animals that move, and making analogies with other statistical physics systems. And we can just model the behavior of these collective motion systems in a very reasonable way, just using also tools borrowed from statistical physics. So if you are interested in any of the things, here is a slide with where you can grab the papers. Yuri is taking a picture, very good. And then let me just mention the team of people that has made possible all this work is Professor Carmen Miguel in University of Barcelona, PhD students Julia Mújica, Andreu Puy, Elena Garcia, and lab technicians Oscar Sánchez, Elizabeth Jimeno, and Jordi Torrents, Python guru. But of course, these are just humans. The important ones here are the fish. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope I didn't bore you to death to be the last lecture of the series.
Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. So we have time, please, if somebody would like to ask, to have some question, please. I see Yuri, please, Yuri.
Thank you. Well, I joined my thanks. It is rather a comment, not a question. When I was looking on the movement of group of fish in the basin, it came to my mind, I saw that the shape of the school changes with the span of time. When they are not
Yes.
moving, they are more round. When they are
Yes.
moving, they are more elongated. And then, some time ago, we were interested in shapes of complex polymers. Some of them were elongated, some of them were round, and so on. And to quantify their shape, we use the properties of gyration tensor, prolateness, asphericity, and we were calculating this gyration tensor. And in terms of eigenvalues of this tensor, we can quantify the shape of group of points, so to say. Now, hearing your report, I thought it might be really interesting to look for the similar properties, not only for the coordinates of the center of mass and gyration radius, but to look for gyration tensor. And in this way, you will quantify the shape and the dynamics of the shape. Have you
Yes.
ever seen things like this doing, which were done for the group of animals?
We actually try to do this thing with master students, and the idea is that okay, let's consider let's think of the school as if it was some lots of sort of blob, sort of membrane thing that is moving and that's interacting against the wall. And the idea was what this thing just analyze the shape, the asphericity, the thing. But this is a work we started with a master student. The master student left, and then this thing is in standby.
I see.
Let's say it's a sort of a work in progress, paralyzed for some time because I mean it's lack of hands to work on many things. But it's a very very interesting question, very interesting point that we started looking at it, and we have some data. We still have to clearly
You are
think about
interested
what we.
somehow. We have some hands and some skills in view in our group which can do this. We were doing this for polymers, so with your data we can do it also, proceeding together for the
Okay, that's
big polymer.
that's a very good idea.
Thanks.
I'll write to you
And yeah,
later.
thank you.
Any more questions? I have some rather general question, mainly to the first part of your report. I am not expert in the theory of systems with power law behavior, and but the question is the following: when we consider the real system, we always would like to exclude the finite size effect in order to see the correct power law behavior. From the other side, the real system always, I think, in most cases are finite, and therefore this part of the distribution which are not described by poor power law could be significant. So, what do you think about this contradiction when we would like to use some advantage of such kind of theory to the description of real system? Very often, this power law is used as some rather general law, and in many cases, people try to explain the situation for the finite system, for the realistic system. What I am interested in your comment.
Well, my comment is that we do have finite size effects and strong ones. But I mean, let's put things in context. We are working in right now with experiments 50, 60 fish. This might look like very small, but compared with standards, it's large. It's really a nice number of fish, experiments with 60 fish. They took a lot to, let's say, to make the trackings to get the digitized data. It's non-trivial. And it's probably possible only in the last year to just do this sort of experiments. But we are just recording for hours, 2 hours, 60 fish. It's really something that people should appreciate. It's from the point of view of biology or collective motion experiments, these are big data. Of course, from the point of view of statistical physics, it's tiny data. It's very small. So we have two sources of finite size effects: the wall tanks and the size of the school. I discussed that this bump in the distributions, you can just almost eliminate it if you just disregard the sides of the tank walls. If you just consider avalanches generated, or let's say that are that take place in the bulk of the tank, this bump, which is one first source of finite size effects, disappears. But anyway, even if disappears, I admitted that we have 1.5 decades of power law at most. And I've worked with many systems with power laws. This is the smallest range of power laws I have ever worked with. And I admit it. But it would be nice to have 1,000 fish or 10,000 fish. But I mean, we need like a cluster of quantum computers to track 1,000 fish.
I see, but even for 1,000 fish, should be the effect which are connected with the finite size,
Yes.
and they have to be taken into account.
Yes. They must be taken into account. But the problem is that I mean, we cannot do a proper finite size scaling analysis. The best thing would be like 1,000 fish, but it's an infinite tank.
I see. Okay, Reinhard.
No experimental way. So we have some finite size effect. We can identify some of them. And the tanks, for whatever reason, they tend to induce huge avalanches. Probably because they get trapped in the corners and they start not knowing what to do and then just make funny movement, and this generates like avalanches of tornadoes which are much larger than you expected. Then when you get rid of those, you get rid of those not just by eliminating large avalanches, but just considering avalanches that more or less take place in the bulk. Then you get better scaling, a little bit longer range of power law. But we will need experiments with a much larger tank and of the order of thousands of fish. I don't know, maybe next generation of physicists can do that.
But it could be the situation similar in nanophysics. You see, the nano objects are interesting because they are objects in which surface plays a very important role. So in order, when we remove the surface, we obtain the usual physics.
Yep.
So in some cases, it's important to have the instrument which allows you to consider correctly the finite size effect.
Also, probably finite size effects can be reduced using a circular tank. Because what is important is the effect of the corners.
I'm sorry, I see Reinhard would like to ask some question. Please, Reinhard.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting talk. What I would like to know is that if your system of equations which you apply to the fish, could you apply this also to, let's say, bacteria, other animals?
Yeah.
In order to demonstrate that the mechanism of movement is induced by the same forces.
Yes, I mean this is just, let's say, if the physics here is that you have some confining potential that has some form, whatever. You fit it to this form, whatever, and then you postulate these equations. And this is some completely general, and this is completely general. These just come from working in polar coordinates. Okay. The rest is just Okay, you need, like, let's say, a compact thing, so moving in a school of things, of bacteria, that they don't just go apart, don't break apart, but they just move together. But this thing is then just apply some mathematical tools to compute these functions here, and this can be applied to any system, not only school of fish. So probably it could be applied to bacteria.
But in some
Surely,
respects,
I don't know what it will result, but in
yeah.
principle, this is something completely general. So here is up to here is more or less physics.
Yeah. But you also have in your, I mean, if you look at the fish, you have some elongated animal. If you look
Yes.
at the bacteria, you just have, I would say, a point.
Yes.
So also the shape of the animal and might have some effect in the pattern you see then.
This should be like a second order approximation. Fish are actual polar things. So they have like an axis that can coincide with the direction of velocity or not. If you want to make like a more exact reproduction of the properties of fish, you should take into account equations with polarity for polar objects. Here we are not considering the polar nature of fish. So this,
Thank you very much.
probably this can be improved.
Thank you.
Any more questions or comments?